The night Evelyn Cross discovered that the man she humiliated at dinner would become her unlikely savior when violence erupted around them, proving that true character reveals itself not in boardrooms, but in moments of crisis. Welcome to tonight's story. I'm about to take you on an emotional journey that will challenge everything you think you know about first impressions and human nature. Stay with me until the very end. You won't want to miss how this unfolds. And please comment below with your city so I can see how far this story travels around the world. Part 1. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Meridian, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, creating rivulets that distorted the city lights beyond. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and inviting, filled with the soft murmur of conversation, the gentle clink of expensive crystal, and the subtle aroma of truffle-infused dishes that cost more than most people's weekly salary. Evelyn Cross sat at table 12, her manicured fingers drumming impatiently against the white linen tablecloth. At 34, she was the youngest CEO in her company's history, having clawed her way to the top of Cross Industries with ruthless determination and an iron will that had crushed every obstacle in her path. Her tailored Armani suit was immaculate, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe chignon that emphasized her sharp cheekbones and calculating blue eyes. Everything about her screamed success power and complete control. She glanced at her Cartier watch for the third time in 5 minutes. 7:15. He was already 15 minutes late, and Evelyn Cross did not wait for anyone. Ever. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, reaching for her phone to call off this entire charade. She should have known better than to let her assistant Margaret talk her into this blind date nonsense. "He comes highly recommended," Margaret had said, with that motherly tone that somehow always managed to penetrate Evelyn's defenses. "A good man, stable kind. Just what you need." What Evelyn needed was someone who could keep up with her world, another CEO, perhaps a successful attorney, or at the very least, someone who understood that time was money and punctuality was respect. She certainly didn't need some random man who couldn't even manage to arrive on time to the most important dinner of his life. Just as she was about to signal for the check, a commotion near the entrance caught her attention. A man was speaking with the hostess, gesturing apologetically. Even from across the restaurant, Evelyn could see he was soaked from the rain, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He wore a simple navy blazer that had seen better days, and when he turned in her direction, she noticed the slight wrinkle in his pants, the modest watch on his wrist. Her heart sank. This had to be him. Daniel Hayes approached the table with measured steps, his brown eyes scanning the restaurant with the careful attention of someone who rarely found himself in such opulent surroundings. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled out his blazer nicely despite its obvious age. His face was honest and open with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. But right now, those eyes held a mixture of nervousness and apology. "Evelyn," he asked, his voice warm and slightly uncertain. "I'm Daniel Hayes. I'm so sorry I'm late. The subway was—" "The subway." Evelyn's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. She didn't stand, didn't extend her hand, didn't even look up from her phone. "You took public transportation to dinner at Meridian." Daniel's cheeks flushed slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Yes, ma'am. I don't own a car in the city. Too expensive to park, and honestly, the subway is usually pretty reliable." He pulled out the chair across from her, the legs scraping slightly against the polished floor. "Again, I apologize for being late. There was a delay on the line." Evelyn finally looked up, her eyes taking in his appearance with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating a business proposal and finding it severely lacking. "I see." And the ensemble, she gestured vaguely at his blazer. Is this your idea of appropriate attire for a restaurant like this? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Daniel looked down at his jacket, then back at her, his expression shifting from apologetic to something harder to read. It's the best I have, he said simply. I thought the important thing was meeting you, not impressing the waitstaff. How wonderfully practical. The word dripped from her lips like poison. Tell me, Daniel, what exactly do you do for a living? Margaret was frustratingly vague about the details. Daniel settled into his chair, seemingly unbothered by her obvious disdain. I'm a high school teacher. History mainly, though I also coach the debate team. His voice carried a quiet pride that only seemed to irritate Evelyn more. I've been at Lincoln High for 8 years now. A teacher. She said it like she might say plague carrier or serial killer. How noble. And the salary for such noble work would be enough to support my daughter and myself comfortably. Daniel replied, his tone remaining steady despite the obvious provocation. We don't need much. Your daughter. Evelyn's eyebrows rose. Margaret failed to mention that particular detail. How old? Emma's 12. She's everything to me. For the first time since sitting down, Daniel's face truly lit up, transforming his features with genuine warmth. Smart as a whip, funny kind. She wants to be a marine biologist when she grows up. Did you know that octopi have 3 hearts? Octopi don't pay college tuition, Evelyn said flatly, or buy houses, or provide the kind of life a child deserves in this city. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Emma has everything she needs and most of what she wants. Love, stability, support. I'd argue those are the things a child deserves most. The waiter appeared at their table, a young man in a crisp white shirt, who clearly recognized Evelyn. Ms. Cross, wonderful to see you again. Your usual table, I see. Can I start you with some wine this evening? The Chateau Margaux, Evelyn said without consulting Daniel. The 2005. Excellent choice. And for the gentleman? Daniel glanced at the wine menu, his eyes widening slightly at the prices. Actually, just water for me, thanks. Still no ice. Evelyn waited until the waiter left before leaning forward slightly. Let me guess. Recovering alcoholic religious objection. Or simply can't afford to split a bottle that costs more than your monthly grocery budget. I don't drink, Daniel said quietly. Personal choice. Nothing dramatic. How terrifically responsible. She practically spat the word. Tell me, in this thrilling career of yours, what exactly are your ambitions, tenure department head? Perhaps one day you'll make principal and really hit the big time. Daniel studied her for a long moment, his brown eyes thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. I want to make a difference. I want to inspire kids to think critically, to understand that history isn't just dates and names, but human stories that matter. I want Emma to see that success isn't just about money, but about impact, about character. Character doesn't pay for Princeton, Evelyn shot back. Character doesn't buy security. Character is what people talk about when they can't afford anything else. Is that what you really believe? Daniel asked, and for the first time there was something sharper in his voice. That money is the only measure of a person's worth. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her blue eyes glittering with cold amusement. I believe in results. I believe in power. I believe in the ability to shape the world rather than just survive in it. Your character might make you feel good about yourself, Daniel, but it won't change the fact that you're a middle-aged man riding the subway to dinner because you can't afford a taxi. The words hit their mark. Daniel's face went very still, and for a moment something flickered behind his eyes, hurt anger, or perhaps just disappointment. But when he spoke again, his voice remained calm. "You know what, Evelyn? You're right about one thing. I can't afford to throw money around like you can. I budget for every dollar because I have responsibilities that matter more than impressing strangers in expensive restaurants." He placed his napkin on the table. "But I can afford to have dignity. I can afford to treat people with respect regardless of their bank account. And I can afford to walk away from someone who thinks cruelty is sophisticated." He started to rise, but Evelyn held up a hand. "Oh, please. Don't make this more dramatic than it needs to be. Sit down. You came all this way on your precious subway. The least you can do is stay for dinner." Daniel paused, half standing, clearly torn between leaving and some deeper impulse to give this woman another chance. The restaurant buzzed around them, other diners lost in their own conversations, unaware of the quiet drama playing out at table 12. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why would you want me to stay when you obviously find everything about me inadequate?" Evelyn tilted her head, considering him with the same calculating expression she used in board meetings. "Honestly, I'm curious. Margaret has excellent judgment about most things, yet she thought we would be compatible. I want to understand what she saw in you that I'm clearly missing." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it wasn't another insult either. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then slowly sank back into his chair. "Fair enough," he said. "Though I have to say your conversational style is unique." "I don't believe in wasting time with pleasantries," Evelyn replied, signaling the waiter. "Life is too short and competition too fierce to pretend we're all equals when we're clearly not." "Equals in what sense?" Daniel asked. "Financially, sure, you've got me beat there. But in terms of basic human worth, I'd like to think we're all starting from the same baseline." Evelyn laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. "How beautifully naive. Tell me, Daniel, when was the last time your baseline humanity got you a seat at a table where actual decisions are made? When did your inherent worth secure funding for your school? When did your equality change a single policy that affects your students' lives?" The waiter returned with Evelyn's wine, performing the elaborate tasting ritual, while Daniel watched with obvious discomfort. When the server offered to pour him a glass, Daniel politely declined again. "To answer your question," Daniel said once they were alone again, "never. But that doesn't mean the fight isn't worth having. Some things matter more than winning. Such as looking at yourself in the mirror and liking the person you see. Such as raising a daughter who judges people by their actions, not their net worth. Such as believing that every student who walks into my classroom deserves my best effort regardless of where they come from or where they're going." Evelyn took a sip of wine, studying him over the rim of her glass. "And how's that working out for you? This noble approach to life, are you happy, Daniel? Are you fulfilled? Do you sleep well at night, knowing you're making such a tremendous difference in the world?" There was something in her tone that made Daniel look at her more carefully. Beneath the sarcasm and condescension, he caught a glimpse of something else, something almost vulnerable. "Most nights, yes," he said honestly. "I'm not saying my life is perfect. Single parenthood is hard. Money is tight. There are days when I question every choice I've made. But at the end of the day, I know who I am. I know what I stand for. That has to count for something." Does it? When your daughter outgrows her clothes, and you have to choose between buying new ones or paying for her school supplies. When she sees her classmates going on vacations you can't afford. When she starts asking why other dads drive nice cars while you take the bus. Daniel's hands tightened slightly on his water glass. Emma understands. Emma is 12. Evelyn interrupted. She understands what you've taught her to understand. But what happens when she's 16 and wants things you can't give her? When she's 18 and her college choices are limited by your financial limitations? When she's 25 and realizes that all your character and principles didn't prepare her for a world that runs on money and connections? Is that what happened to you? Daniel asked quietly. The question caught Evelyn off guard. She set down her wine glass with deliberate precision, her expression hardening. Excuse me. You talk about money and power like someone who learned early that everything else is worthless. I'm wondering what taught you that lesson. For a moment, the mask slipped entirely. Evelyn's face went very pale, and her blue eyes flashed with something raw and unguarded. But just as quickly, the armor was back in place. My personal history isn't up for discussion with someone I met 20 minutes ago, she said coldly. Especially someone who thinks wisdom comes from teenagers and subway tokens. Fair enough, Daniel said. But for what it's worth, I think you're wrong about one thing. Money doesn't protect people from pain. It just changes the color of it. Before Evelyn could respond, their waiter returned with menus. The interruption gave both of them a moment to regroup, to step back from the edge of whatever precipice they'd been approaching. The special tonight is pan-seared halibut with winter truffle risotto, the waiter explained. Chef also recommends the dry-aged ribeye with roasted bone marrow butter. Daniel opened his menu and immediately felt his stomach drop. The cheapest entree was $48. The ribeye was $75. He did quick mental math. Dinner here would cost him nearly a week's worth of groceries. Evelyn, watching his face, smiled with shark-like satisfaction. Something wrong? Just deciding, Daniel said evenly. He closed the menu and looked at the waiter. I'll have the house salad, please. Dressing on the side. That's it, Evelyn asked. Just a salad at Meridian. I'm not very hungry, Daniel lied. Nonsense, we're celebrating. Waiter, bring him the ribeye, medium rare, and the lobster tail as well. Surf and turf. Ma'am, I really don't need, Daniel started. My treat, Evelyn said with false magnanimity. I insist. After all, it's not every day a public school teacher gets to experience fine dining. The condescension in her voice was unmistakable. Every word was calculated to emphasize the gulf between them, to remind him that she held all the power in this interaction. Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he managed to keep his voice level. Thank you, but I'll stick with the salad. Oh, come now. Don't be proud. I can afford it, and you obviously can't. There's no shame in accepting help from those more fortunate. The words hung in the air like a slap. Around them, the restaurant continued its gentle hum of conversation and clinking silverware, but at table 12 the silence stretched taut as a wire. You know what? Daniel said finally, his voice very quiet. You're right. I can't afford to eat here. This dinner will probably cost me more than I spend on food in a month. But the difference between us isn't just financial, Evelyn. The difference is that I would never use my advantages to humiliate another person. I'm not humiliating you, Evelyn protested, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. I'm simply acknowledging reality. You're out of your league here, Daniel. This restaurant, this lifestyle, this entire world, it's not meant for people like you. People like me, people who settle, people who accept mediocrity and call it virtue, people who choose comfort over ambition and then pretend it's some kind of moral victory. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, his brown eyes sad rather than angry. Is that really what you think? That I chose this life because I was too lazy or too cowardly to want more. Didn't you? I chose this life because my daughter needed stability after her mother died, Daniel said quietly. I chose teaching because it gave me summers off to spend with Emma. I chose our neighborhood because it was safe and the schools were good. I chose the subway because it meant I could afford her music lessons and summer camp and the 100 other things that make childhood magical. Every choice I've made for the past 6 years has been about giving her the best life possible within my means. The mention of his daughter's mother dying seemed to give Evelyn pause, but only briefly. That's very touching, she said, though her voice held no warmth. But good intentions don't change the fact that you're limiting her future by accepting your own limitations. And what would you have me do? Daniel asked. Abandon my principles, step on other people to climb some ladder that might not even lead where I want to go, teach my daughter that success means becoming someone you can't stand to look at in the mirror. I'd have you wake up, Evelyn snapped. I'd have you realize that the world doesn't care about your principles. It cares about results. It cares about power. It cares about the ability to make things happen, not just the desire to make them happen. And you've made things happen. I've built an empire, Evelyn said with cold pride. I employ over 3,000 people. I generate millions in revenue. I make decisions that affect markets, that influence policy, that actually matter in the real world. At what cost? The question seemed to surprise her. What do you mean? I mean, what did you have to give up to build that empire? What did you have to become? Who did you have to stop being? Evelyn's jaw tightened. I became someone who matters. Someone who doesn't have to apologize for taking up space in the world. Someone who doesn't have to worry about whether she can afford dinner or whether her child will have opportunities. But are you happy? The question was so simple, so direct, that it seemed to catch Evelyn completely off guard. She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. For a moment, her carefully constructed facade wavered. Happiness is a luxury, she said finally. I deal in necessities. That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters. Their food arrived then, saving them both from the increasingly uncomfortable direction of the conversation. Daniel's salad looked lonely and sparse next to Evelyn's expertly prepared seafood course, but he ate it without complaint, even though he could feel her watching him with a mixture of pity and disdain. Tell me about your daughter, Evelyn said, suddenly catching him off guard with the apparent change of subject. Daniel's face immediately softened. Emma, she's incredible. Brilliant, funny kind. She has this way of seeing the world that just amazes me. Last week she convinced her entire class to do a beach cleanup for Earth Day. 12-year-olds voluntarily giving up their Saturday to pick up trash because Emma made them understand why it mattered. Admirable, Evelyn said dryly. I'm sure the beach was very grateful. Did the cleanup generate any revenue, create any jobs, influence any environmental policy? Daniel set down his fork carefully. It taught a dozen kids that they have the power to make a difference, that they don't have to wait for permission or official authorization to care about their world. That's worth more than revenue. Is it? When those kids grow up and realize that caring doesn't pay the bills, when they discover that passion doesn't trump practical considerations, what then? Then hopefully they'll remember that there's more to life than bills and practical considerations. Evelyn laughed, a sound devoid of humor. You really believe that, don't you? You actually think that idealism and good intentions can compete with cold, hard reality? I think, Daniel said slowly, that people like you create the reality you're talking about. You decide that money is all that matters, and then you structure the world to reflect that belief. But it doesn't have to be that way. Oh, please, Don't blame me for the way the world works. I didn't create capitalism. I didn't invent competition. I didn't establish the fundamental rule that resources are limited and only the strong survive. I just learned to play by the rules instead of pretending they don't exist. But you perpetuate those rules, Daniel pointed out. Every time you choose profit over people, every time you use your power to crush rather than lift up, every time you treat human worth like a commodity, you're reinforcing the very system you claim is inevitable. Evelyn's eyes flashed with anger. Don't lecture me about human worth, Daniel. You have no idea what I've sacrificed, what I've overcome, what I've had to endure to get where I am. You sit in your comfortable little classroom, with your comfortable little principles, protected from the real world by taxpayers and government regulations, and you judge people who actually have to compete for survival. I'm not judging you, Daniel said quietly. I'm just trying to understand you. Understand me? Evelyn's voice rose slightly, causing a few nearby diners to glance in their direction. You want to understand me? Fine. I'll tell you exactly who I am. I'm someone who learned early that the world is divided into two types of people, those who take and those who get taken from. I decided which side I wanted to be on, and I've never looked back. That's a sad way to see the world. It's an accurate way to see the world. Your optimism is charming, Daniel, truly, but it's also naive. The fact that you can afford to believe in human goodness just proves how sheltered your life has been. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. You know what's interesting? You keep talking about my life like it's been easy, like I've been protected from hardship. But I've buried a wife, raised a daughter alone, lived paycheck to paycheck for years, and watched talented kids give up on their dreams because they couldn't see a way forward. The difference between us isn't that I've had it easier. The difference is that hardship made me more compassionate, not less. Evelyn stared at him, something shifting behind her blue eyes. For just a moment, her expression softened, as if his words had found some buried part of her that still remembered what compassion felt like. But then the mask slammed back into place. Compassion is a luxury you can afford because you've accepted defeat, she said harshly. You've given up on changing anything meaningful so you can afford to be kind to the other losers. The words were designed to wound, and they did. Daniel flinched as if she had struck him physically. But when he looked at her again, there was something new in his expression, not anger, but something deeper and more troubling. I feel sorry for you, he said simply. Evelyn's face went white. Excuse me, I feel sorry for you. All that power, all that money, all that success, and you're still so angry, so bitter, so convinced that everyone else is your enemy. What kind of life is that? It's a life that matters, Evelyn snapped, but there was something desperate in her voice now. It's a life that has impact, that makes a difference, that leaves you eating alone in expensive restaurants, using your wealth as a weapon against people who can't fight back. Daniel finished quietly. That's not power, Evelyn. That's just cruelty wearing a designer dress. The accusation hung between them like a physical thing. Evelyn opened her mouth to deliver what would undoubtedly be a devastating response, her blue eyes blazing with fury. But before she could speak, a commotion erupted near the restaurant's bar area. Raised voices cut through the gentle ambiance of Meridian like knives through silk. Other diners began turning in their seats, concerned murmurs rippling across the dining room. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a disagreement between a patron and the bartender, the kind of minor drama that occasionally disrupted even the most exclusive establishments. But then the voices grew louder, more aggressive, and the comfortable bubble of wealth and refinement that had surrounded their evening began to crack around the edges. Daniel's attention immediately shifted toward the disturbance, his body tensing, with an alertness that seemed instinctive. Evelyn, meanwhile, merely looked annoyed that their argument had been interrupted by what she clearly considered beneath her notice. "As I was saying," she began, but Daniel held up a hand, his eyes fixed on the growing chaos near the bar. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. And in that moment, as the first crash of breaking glass echoed through Meridian's elegant dining room, Evelyn Cross was about to discover that sometimes the most important lessons come not from boardrooms or balance sheets, but from the split-second choices people make when everything falls apart. The evening that had begun with cruel words and petty humiliations was about to become something else entirely, something that would strip away all pretense and reveal exactly what kind of people they really were when it mattered most. The sound of shattering glass sent a ripple of unease through the restaurant's refined atmosphere. What had started as muffled voices near the bar was escalating into something more sinister. Daniel's protective instincts, honed by years of managing unruly teenagers and looking out for his daughter, immediately kicked into high gear. He half rose from his seat, his eyes scanning the scene with the careful assessment of someone who understood that situations could deteriorate quickly. Evelyn, however, remained seated, her expression one of irritated disdain. "Oh, wonderful," she muttered, taking another sip of her wine. "Some drunk businessman can't handle his liquor. How terribly surprising." "Evelyn, I think we should," Daniel began, but she cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Should what flee because some Wall Street type is having a tantrum, please? I've seen worse behavior in board meetings." She glanced around the restaurant with the casual arrogance of someone who believed wealth could insulate her from any real danger. "The staff will handle it. That's what we pay premium prices for, to avoid dealing with life's unpleasantries." But Daniel wasn't listening to her dismissive commentary. His attention was focused entirely on the disturbance, which was growing more volatile by the minute. Near the bar, a man in an expensive suit was gesticulating wildly at the bartender, his voice carrying across the dining room, despite the staff's obvious attempts to calm him down. "You don't understand," the man was shouting. His words slurred, but his anger crystal clear. "I've lost everything. Everything. Do you know what that means?" The bartender, a young woman with kind eyes who clearly wanted to help, was speaking in soothing tones that Daniel couldn't quite make out from across the room. But whatever she was saying wasn't working. The man's agitation was increasing, his movements becoming more erratic and unpredictable. "Sir, perhaps we could step outside and—" Another staff member approached, but the angry patron wheeled on him with such sudden fury that several nearby diners pushed back from their tables. "Don't touch me!" the man screamed. "Don't any of you touch me! You have no idea what I'm capable of." That's when Daniel saw it, the telltale bulge beneath the man's jacket. The way his hand kept moving toward his waist, the wild look in his eyes that spoke of someone who had passed beyond rational thought into something much darker and more dangerous. "Evelyn," Daniel said urgently, his voice low but commanding. "We need to leave. Now." She looked at him with amusement, as if his concern was just another example of his weakness. "Really, Daniel, you're being absurd. This is Meridian, not some dive bar in Queens. The security here is—" "There is no security." Daniel interrupted, his eyes still fixed on the escalating situation. "Look around. The staff is young, untrained for this kind of situation. And that man isn't just drunk, he's armed." The word armed finally penetrated Evelyn's bubble of superiority. Her blue eyes sharpened following Daniel's gaze to the man near the bar. For the first time since they'd sat down, she looked genuinely concerned. "Armed, how can you possibly know that?" "Because I've seen it before," Daniel said grimly. 3 years ago, a former student came to school with a gun. I spent 2 hours talking him down in my classroom while the police surrounded the building. You learn to recognize the signs. The gravity in his voice seemed to finally break through Evelyn's arrogant facade. She set down her wineglass, her hand trembling slightly. What signs? The way he's standing, the way he keeps touching his side, the look in his eyes. He's not just angry, he's desperate. And desperate people with weapons are the most dangerous kind. As if to prove Daniel's point, the man at the bar suddenly swept his arm across the surface, sending dozens of glasses crashing to the floor. The sound was explosive in the confined space, and several women screamed. The elegant ambiance of Meridian shattered, along with the crystal replaced by something primal and terrifying. "Everyone stay calm," the man shouted, his voice now clearly audible throughout the restaurant. "Nobody move. Nobody call anyone. This doesn't have to get ugly, but it will if you don't listen to me." The dining room erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped against the floor as patrons tried to back away from the disturbance. Some people were reaching for their phones, others were looking toward the exits, and a few were simply frozen in terror. The carefully orchestrated ballet of fine dining had devolved into pandemonium in a matter of seconds. Daniel was already moving his chair, pushed back his body, positioned between Evelyn and the threat. "We're leaving," he said firmly. "Now, stay behind me and move slowly toward the kitchen entrance." But Evelyn, despite her earlier concern, seemed paralyzed by the suddenness of it all. She remained seated, staring at the chaos with wide eyes, as if she couldn't quite process that her carefully controlled world was falling apart around her. "Evelyn," Daniel's voice cut through her shock. "We need to go. I can't." She whispered, her usual commanding presence completely absent. This doesn't happen to people like me." The raw vulnerability in her voice was so at odds with her earlier cruelty that Daniel felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. Without thinking, he reached for her hand, surprised by how cold her fingers were. "It's happening to everyone right now," he said gently but urgently. "And right now we need to focus on getting out safely." Meanwhile, the situation near the bar was deteriorating rapidly. The man, who appeared to be in his 40s, well-dressed but disheveled, was now openly weeping as he shouted at the terrified staff. 20 years, he was saying, his voice breaking with emotion. 20 years I gave them, 20 years of my life, and they threw me away like garbage. Said the market was changing. Said they needed fresh blood. Said they appreciated my contributions, but... His words dissolved into incoherent sobbing, but his hand remained ominously close to whatever weapon he was carrying. The bartender, to her credit, was still trying to engage him in conversation, her voice calm and soothing, despite the obvious danger. "Sir, I'm so sorry about what happened to you," she was saying. "That sounds incredibly unfair, but maybe we could talk about it somewhere more private." "Maybe private," the man laughed bitterly. "There is no private anymore. They took everything, my job, my house, my family. My wife left me, took the kids. Said she couldn't be married to a failure. Do you understand? I have nothing left." Daniel felt Evelyn's hand tighten in his as the man's words registered. There was something in the stranger's pain that seemed to resonate with her, some recognition that made her face go even paler. "He's talking about losing everything," she whispered almost to herself. "About being thrown away." "Evelyn, we can't help him if we become victims ourselves," Daniel said urgently. "We need to." But his words were cut off as the man suddenly reached into his jacket and pulled out what Daniel had feared most, a small but deadly-looking handgun. Screams erupted throughout the restaurant as diners scrambled for cover, overturning tables and chairs in their desperation to escape. "Nobody leaves!" the man shouted, waving the gun wildly. "Nobody calls for help. You're all going to listen to what I have to say. You're going to understand what it feels like to lose everything." Daniel's military training from his brief stint in the National Guard kicked in immediately. He assessed the situation with cold clarity, one gunman emotionally unstable positioned near the main entrance. The kitchen entrance was across the dining room, too far to reach safely. Their best option was to take cover and wait for an opportunity. "Under the table," he whispered to Evelyn, pulling her down just as the gunman's wild gesturing sent another wave of terror through the room. But Evelyn resisted her corporate instincts warring with common sense. "I am not hiding under a table like some frightened child," she hissed. "I'm calling security. I'm calling the police. You're going to get us both killed if you don't listen to me," Daniel said sharply, his patience finally cracking. "This isn't a business negotiation, Evelyn. This isn't something you can control with money or authority. This is about survival, and right now I'm the one with experience in crisis situations." The firmness in his voice, so different from his earlier gentle demeanor, seemed to shock her into compliance. She allowed him to guide her down behind the overturned table, her designer dress pooling around her on the restaurant's polished floor. From their hiding spot, they could hear the gunman continuing his desperate monologue, his voice alternating between rage and heartbreak. "You all sit there in your expensive clothes, eating your fancy food, thinking you're safe from the real world," he was saying. "But it can all disappear in an instant. One day, you're on top, the next day, you're nothing. Nobody cares about your years of service, your loyalty, your dedication." Daniel found himself studying Evelyn's face as she listened to the man's words. Something was happening behind her blue eyes, some internal struggle that went deeper than fear. She was hearing something in the gunman's pain that clearly affected her in ways she hadn't expected. "He's not wrong," she whispered so quietly that Daniel almost didn't hear her. "What?" "About how quickly it can all disappear. About how little loyalty means in the business world." Her voice was distant, thoughtful. "I've done it myself. Thrown away 20-year employees because the numbers didn't work anymore. Destroyed careers to save quarterly profits." Daniel stared at her, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman beneath the corporate armor. "Evelyn, I always told myself it was just business," she continued as if she hadn't heard him. "That personal feelings couldn't interfere with practical decisions. That survival of the fittest was just natural law applied to economics." Another crash from across the room reminded them both of their immediate danger. The gunman had apparently knocked over another table, and his voice was growing more agitated by the minute. "But listening to him," Evelyn whispered, hearing the pain in his voice, "I'm wondering if I've been lying to myself all these years." Daniel felt a strange mix of emotions as he watched her grapple with this unexpected self-awareness. Part of him wanted to comfort her, to tell her that recognizing the problem was the first step toward fixing it. But another part, the part that still stung from her earlier cruelty, wanted to point out that this epiphany was coming a little late for all the lives she'd already destroyed. Before he could respond, however, the situation escalated again. A young waiter, apparently trying to reach the kitchen, had moved too quickly and caught the gunman's attention. "Where do you think you're going?" the man screamed, swinging the weapon toward the terrified server. "I said nobody moves, nobody leaves." The waiter froze his hands, raised his face white with terror. He couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, probably working his way through college, completely unprepared for anything like this. "Please, sir," the young man stammered. I was just trying to get to the kitchen. I wasn't leaving, I swear." "Liar," the gunman shouted. "You were going to call for help. You were going to bring the police. No, sir, I wasn't. Don't lie to me. The gun was now pointed directly at the waiter's chest. I'm sick of lies, sick of people pretending to care when all they really want is to get away from you. Daniel felt his muscles tense. The situation was spiraling out of control, and that young waiter was about to become a casualty of one man's broken psyche. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to intervene, to do something to protect an innocent person who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Daniel, no, Evelyn whispered, apparently reading his intentions. You can't. You'll just make it worse. That kid is about to die, Daniel said grimly, his eyes fixed on the scene across the room. And if you try to play hero, you'll die too, and probably me along with you. Her words were practical, logical, the kind of cold calculation that had probably served her well in business. But they struck Daniel as fundamentally wrong, a perfect example of the selfishness he'd been criticizing all evening. So we just watch, he asked. We just let it happen because it's safer for us. Evelyn's face was conflicted, torn between her natural instinct for self-preservation and something else, something that his earlier words about character and compassion had apparently awakened. I don't know, she admitted, and the uncertainty in her voice was perhaps the most honest thing she'd said all evening. The standoff continued for several agonizing seconds. The waiter stood frozen, the gunman's finger tightening on the trigger, and the rest of the restaurant held its collective breath. It was one of those moments when time seems suspended, when everyone present understands that they're witnessing something that will change them forever. And then, just as Daniel was preparing to throw caution to the wind and attempt to save the young waiter, something unexpected happened. The gunman's composure cracked completely. Instead of pulling the trigger, he suddenly collapsed against the bar, the weapon clattering to the floor as he dissolved into heartbroken sobs. I can't, he was saying over and over. I can't do this. I'm not a killer. I'm just so tired of hurting. The sudden shift from violence to vulnerability was jarring. The waiter scrambled away from the collapsed man, and several other staff members cautiously approached, unsure whether this was genuine remorse or just another unpredictable swing in his emotional state. Daniel felt Evelyn's hand find his arm, her fingers gripping tightly as they both watched the scene unfold. The immediate threat seemed to have passed, but the emotional weight of what they'd just witnessed hung heavy in the air. He's just broken, Evelyn said softly. Completely broken. Yeah, Daniel agreed. And somebody's going to have to help put him back together. They remained hidden behind their overturned table for several more minutes, until it became clear that the gunman had genuinely surrendered. Police sirens were now audible in the distance, growing closer by the second. The staff was working to carefully secure the weapon while keeping the distraught man calm. As they finally emerged from their hiding spot, Daniel couldn't help but notice how different Evelyn looked. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged, her expensive dress wrinkled and stained from crouching on the floor. But more than that, her entire demeanor had changed. The cold arrogance was gone, replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. Are you okay? He asked, genuinely concerned, despite everything that had passed between them earlier. She nodded slowly, but her eyes remained fixed on the broken man who was now being comforted by the very staff members he'd threatened just minutes before. Daniel, she said quietly, what you said earlier about me using my wealth as a weapon, you were right. The admission seemed to cost her something, as if acknowledging her cruelty required dismantling some fundamental part of how she saw herself. Evelyn. No, let me finish. She turned to face him, and he was surprised to see tears in her eyes. Watching that man fall apart, hearing him talk about being thrown away like garbage, I realized that I've done that. Not just once, but hundreds of times. I've destroyed people's lives and told myself it was just business. Daniel studied her face, looking for signs that this was just another manipulation, another way to gain advantage. But what he saw was genuine remorse, the kind of raw honesty that couldn't be faked. "What are you saying?" he asked carefully. "I'm saying that maybe there's more than one way to be broken." She gestured toward the gunman, who was now being led away by police officers who had arrived with surprising speed. "He lost everything, and it destroyed him. I got everything, and it destroyed me too, just in a different way." The observation was so unexpected, so fundamentally at odds with everything she'd said earlier, that Daniel found himself speechless. This wasn't the same woman who had mocked his subway ride and criticized his career choices. This was someone else entirely, someone who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. "Evelyn," he said gently, "recognizing a problem is the first step toward pardon. Toward what redemption do you really think someone like me can change? After all the damage I've done, all the lives I've ruined, in the name of profit and efficiency?" The question hung between them as police officers moved through the restaurant, taking statements from witnesses and ensuring that the scene was secure. Other diners were being escorted out, their evening of luxury dining transformed into something they'd never forget. "I think," Daniel said slowly, "that people can change if they really want to, but it requires admitting that change is necessary, and it requires being willing to do the hard work of becoming someone different." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't even know who I used to be anymore. Before the money, before the power, before I decided that compassion was weakness, I can barely remember what it felt like to care about someone other than myself." "Then maybe that's where you start," Daniel suggested. "By remembering who you were before you became who you thought you needed to be." The conversation was interrupted by a police officer who needed their statements about what they'd witnessed. As they recounted the evening's events, Daniel found himself watching Evelyn carefully. The change in her seemed genuine, but he'd learned long ago that crisis situations could bring out temporary emotions that faded once the immediate danger passed. Still, there was something different about the way she spoke to the officer, with courtesy, rather than condescension, with appreciation for his service, rather than irritation at the inconvenience. Small changes, perhaps, but significant ones for someone who had spent the first part of the evening treating everyone around her as inferior. When the officer finished taking their statements, he informed them that they were free to leave. The restaurant would be closed for the rest of the evening while the investigation continued, and they would need to be available for follow-up questions if necessary. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, Evelyn turned to Daniel with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I know this might sound strange after everything that's happened," she said hesitantly. "But would you be willing to continue our conversation somewhere else? I feel like there are things I need to understand, things I need to figure out, and I think you might be able to help me with that." Daniel was torn. Part of him wanted to refuse to write off this apparent transformation as a temporary reaction to trauma. The woman who had spent the first hour of their dinner systematically humiliating him didn't deserve his help or his compassion. But another part of him, the teacher part, the part that believed in second chances and human potential, was intrigued by the possibility that this crisis had genuinely opened something in her that had been closed for too long. "What kind of conversation?" he asked carefully. "An honest one," she said simply. The kind where I don't try to prove I'm better than you and you don't let me get away with lying to myself. The kind where maybe I can figure out how to become someone I can actually respect. The request was so humble, so different from anything he might have expected from the Evelyn Cross he'd met at the beginning of the evening, that Daniel found his resistance crumbling. "Okay," he said finally. "But not here, and not anywhere like here. Somewhere real, somewhere that doesn't remind either of us of the game you've been playing all evening." A small smile played at the corners of Evelyn's mouth, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all night. "I know just the place," she said, "if you trust me enough to follow my lead for once." As they walked out of Meridian together, past the police cars and crime scene tape, Daniel couldn't help but wonder what he was getting himself into. The evening had already taken so many unexpected turns that he was beginning to doubt his ability to predict what might happen next. But one thing was certain: the woman walking beside him was not the same woman who had mocked his subway ride just hours before. Whether that change would last beyond tonight remained to be seen, but for the first time since they'd sat down to dinner, Daniel found himself genuinely curious about who Evelyn Cross might become if she ever learned to stop being who she thought she had to be. The place Evelyn led him to was nothing like what Daniel had expected. After leaving the chaos of Meridian behind, she had guided him through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan to a small, unassuming diner tucked between a laundromat and a used bookstore in a neighborhood that clearly hadn't felt the touch of gentrification. The neon sign flickered intermittently, casting pink and blue shadows across the wet pavement, and the windows were fogged with condensation from the warmth inside. "Here?" Daniel asked, genuine surprise coloring his voice as they stood outside the entrance. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, her hand on the door handle as if she were second-guessing her decision. "I know it doesn't look like much," she said quietly, "but this place, it matters to me. More than you might think." The interior was exactly what the exterior had promised: worn vinyl booths, cracked linoleum floors, and the kind of lighting that revealed every flaw rather than hiding it. The air smelled of coffee that had been sitting too long, and burgers that had been grilled on equipment that had seen better decades. It was the antithesis of everything Evelyn Cross represented, which made her choice all the more intriguing. A waitress who looked to be in her 60s approached them with the easy familiarity of someone who had seen every type of customer imaginable. Her name tag read Dolores, and her smile was genuinely warm despite the late hour and their obviously disheveled appearance. "Well, I'll be damned," Dolores said, her voice carrying the hint of an accent that might have been Queens or Brooklyn. "Evie, is that really you, honey?" Daniel watched in amazement as Evelyn's entire demeanor shifted again, but this time toward something softer, more vulnerable than he had yet seen. "Hello, Dolores," Evelyn said, and there was an affection in her voice that seemed completely at odds with the cold, corporate executive he had met earlier. "It's been too long." "Too long, honey, it's been almost 15 years. Dolores looked her up and down, taking in the expensive dress, the designer shoes, the subtle signs of wealth that even the evening's chaos couldn't completely disguise. "Look at you. Just look at you. Though I have to say you look like you've been through the ringer tonight." "Something like that," Evelyn admitted. "Dolores, this is Daniel. Daniel, this is Dolores. She knew me when I was someone else entirely." Dolores extended a hand to Daniel with the kind of genuine warmth that couldn't be manufactured. "Any friend of Evie's is a friend of mine. Though I have to say I'm curious as hell about what brings our girl back to this neck of the woods after all these years." "So am I," Daniel said honestly, glancing at Evelyn with renewed interest. Dolores led them to a booth in the corner, away from the few other late-night customers who were nursing coffee and picking at plates of comfort food. As they settled into the cracked vinyl seats, Daniel couldn't help but notice how different Evelyn looked in this environment. The harsh lighting should have been unflattering, but instead it seemed to strip away the last vestiges of her corporate armor, revealing someone younger, more uncertain, more human. "Coffee?" Dolores asked, already reaching for the pot she had carried with her. "Please," Evelyn said. "And Dolores, could you make it like you used to, with the extra cream, 2 sugars, and a dash of cinnamon?" Dolores finished with a grin. "Some things a person never forgets." "What about you, honey?" she asked Daniel. "Black is fine, thanks." As Dolores poured their coffee, she kept stealing glances at Evelyn, as if she couldn't quite believe her eyes. "You know," she said conversationally, "I used to wonder what happened to you. After you stopped coming around, I mean. I asked your grandmother about you a few times, but she always got that sad look in her eyes and changed the subject." "My grandmother—" Daniel looked between the two women, pieces of a puzzle beginning to alter into place. "She died about 10 years ago," Evelyn said quietly, her fingers wrapped around the coffee cup, as if drawing warmth from it. "Cancer. I was in Tokyo when it happened, closing a deal that couldn't wait." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Dolores reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. She was so proud of you, you know. Always talking about her granddaughter who was going to conquer the world." "Was she?" Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. "Proud, I mean. Even after I stopped coming to see her. Even after I became too busy and too important to visit." "She understood," Dolores said gently. "She knew you were building something big. She missed you. We all did." Daniel watched this exchange with growing fascination. This was clearly a side of Evelyn that she had buried so deeply that even she seemed surprised by its emergence. The grief in her voice when she spoke about her grandmother, the genuine affection between her and Dolores, none of it fit with the cold, calculating woman who had mocked his career choices just hours earlier. "Dolores," Evelyn said suddenly, "could you tell Daniel about the girl who used to come here, the one who sat in this exact booth doing homework and dreaming about changing the world?" Dolores settled into the booth beside Daniel, clearly prepared to indulge in some serious reminiscing. "Oh, that girl. She was something special, let me tell you. Smart as a whip, but not in a show-off way. Kind, too. Always asking about my kids, always remembering little details about people's lives." "She's exaggerating," Evelyn said, but there was a wistfulness in her voice. "The hell I am," Dolores laughed. "You want to know what kind of kid she was? There was this one time she couldn't have been more than 16 when this homeless guy came in. Old fellow probably about my age now looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Most people would have looked the other way, but not our Evie. She bought him dinner, sat with him while he ate, listened to his stories about Vietnam." Daniel studied Evelyn's face as Dolores spoke, watching the play of emotions across her features. There was embarrassment there, but also something deeper, a recognition of someone she used to be, and perhaps mourned losing. "What happened to that guy?" Daniel asked. "Well, that's the thing," Dolores continued. "Turns out he was a veteran who'd fallen through the cracks. Evie didn't just buy him one meal, she spent weeks helping him navigate the VA system, get his benefits sorted out, find housing. She was relentless when she believed in something." "I was naive," Evelyn said dismissively, but Daniel could hear the defensive note in her voice. "You were compassionate," Daniel corrected. "There's a difference." Evelyn looked at him sharply, as if his words had hit closer to home than she was comfortable with. "Compassion doesn't pay the bills, Daniel. It doesn't build companies or create jobs or generate wealth that can actually make a difference in the world. Doesn't it? Dolores interjected quietly. Because I seem to remember a young woman who was going to use her business degree to create companies that treated their employees like human beings, who was going to prove that you could be successful without stepping on people. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Daniel could see the internal struggle playing out on Evelyn's face, the collision between who she had been and who she had become. Things change, Evelyn said finally. The real world has a way of teaching you that idealism is a luxury you can't afford. Or maybe, Daniel suggested gently, the real world teaches you that idealism is the only thing that makes success worth having. Evelyn's blue eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been pain. Don't you dare lecture me about idealism, Daniel. You have no idea what I've had to sacrifice, what I've had to become to get where I am. Then tell me, Daniel said simply. Help me understand how the girl Dolores is describing became the woman who spent the first hour of our dinner trying to destroy my self-worth. The directness of the question seemed to catch Evelyn off guard. She opened her mouth to deliver what would undoubtedly be a sharp retort, then closed it again. For a long moment she simply stared into her coffee cup, as if the answers she sought might be found in its dark depths. You want to know what changed me, she said, finally, her voice so quiet that Daniel had to lean forward to hear her. I'll tell you exactly what changed me. Dolores, sensing the shift in mood, quietly excused herself to tend to other customers, but not before squeezing Evelyn's shoulder in a gesture of support that spoke of genuine affection. I was 25. Evelyn began, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone reliving painful memories. Fresh out of business school, full of ideas about ethical capitalism and corporate responsibility, I'd managed to get a job at a small investment firm, nothing glamorous, but they seemed to share my values. The CEO talked about stakeholder capitalism, about balancing profit with purpose. She paused, taking a sip of coffee that seemed more about buying time than actual thirst. There was this deal, she continued. A manufacturing company in Ohio that was struggling. Family-owned, been in business for 3 generations, employed about 800 people, in a town where they were basically the only game in town. The company was profitable, just not profitable enough for the new economy. The CEO wanted to restructure, modernize, find ways to help them compete. Daniel sensed where this story was heading, but he remained silent, letting her tell it in her own way. I spent months working on that deal. I got to know the family that owned the company, spent time in the town, met the workers. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were real people with real lives, real dreams. I developed a plan that would have saved most of the jobs while still delivering reasonable returns to investors. Her hands were trembling slightly around the coffee cup, and Daniel noticed that her voice was growing tighter with each word. The plan was brilliant, if I do say so myself. It would have worked, but when I presented it to the board, they laughed at me. Literally laughed. They said I was being naive, that my plan was too complicated, too risky, too concerned with outcomes that weren't their responsibility. What did they do instead? Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew. They gutted the company, Evelyn said flatly. Sold off the assets, moved production overseas, liquidated everything of value. 800 people lost their jobs overnight. The town basically died. Families that had lived there for generations had to start over with nothing. The pain in her voice was raw, immediate, as if the betrayal had happened yesterday rather than nearly a decade ago. And you, Daniel prompted gently. I was furious. I threatened to quit, to expose what they had done, to fight them in court. But then my boss, a woman I had respected, admired, even looked up to, sat me down and explained the facts of life. Evelyn's voice had gone very flat now, as if the emotion was too much to bear. She told me that the business world was full of idealistic young people who thought they could change the system from within. She said most of them ended up broke and bitter watching from the sidelines, while other people made the real decisions. She offered me a choice I could accept, that this was how the world worked, and learn to succeed within it, or I could cling to my principles and spend the rest of my career being irrelevant. "And you chose success," Daniel said. "It wasn't a question." "I chose survival," Evelyn corrected. "I chose to matter, to have influence, to be in a position where I could actually affect outcomes instead of just watching helplessly from the moral high ground." "But did you," Daniel asked quietly, "did you actually affect outcomes, or did you just become part of the machine that creates more stories like that Ohio town?" The question hit its mark. Evelyn flinched as if he had slapped her, her blue eyes filling with something that might have been tears. "That's not fair," she whispered. "Isn't it?" "How many towns have you helped destroy since then, Evelyn? How many families have you torn apart in the name of efficiency and profit maximization? How many times have you become the person who laughed at some idealistic young analyst who wanted to save jobs instead of just liquidating them?" Each question was like a physical blow, and Daniel could see the walls Evelyn had built around herself beginning to crumble. But he pressed on, driven by something deeper than cruelty, a recognition that sometimes the truth had to hurt before it could heal. "You said you chose to matter," he continued. "But what if mattering the way you've chosen to matter has made you into exactly the kind of person who destroyed that young woman's faith in the possibility of ethical business? What if you've become the villain in someone else's origin story?" Evelyn's composure finally broke completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and her shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. For several long minutes, she couldn't speak at all, leaving Daniel to wonder if he had pushed too hard, gone too far. "I know," she finally managed to say, her voice broken and raw. "I know what I've become. I know what I've done. Do you think I don't see their faces sometimes? The people whose lives I've destroyed in the name of shareholder value and market efficiency." She wiped at her eyes with a napkin that Dolores had quietly left on the table, her makeup smearing in a way that somehow made her look more human than any designer cosmetics ever could. "There was a woman," Evelyn continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "about 3 years ago. We were restructuring a retail chain, closing underperforming stores. She came to the meeting where we announced the closures. She was maybe 50, had worked for the company for 22 years. She stood up in the back of the room and asked if there was any way to save her store, said it was the only decent employer in her small town, said she had kids in college and a mother in a nursing home." Daniel remained silent, sensing that this was a confession that had been building for years. "And I looked her right in the eye," Evelyn said. "And I told her that personal circumstances couldn't factor into business decisions. That the numbers were the numbers and the store simply wasn't viable. I said it with such authority, such finality, that she just sat down and accepted it. But the numbers were wrong, or rather, they were right from a quarterly perspective, but wrong from a long-term perspective. That store could have been saved with minimal investment. It was serving a community that had few alternatives. But saving it would have cost us 2 cents per share in the next quarter, and the board had made it clear that nothing could interfere with hitting our targets." She looked up at Daniel, her eyes red and haunted. "I found out later that she killed herself. Left a note saying she couldn't face starting over at her age, couldn't bear the thought of disappointing her family." The confession hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Daniel felt his anger at her earlier behavior drain away, replaced by something more complex, a mixture of sadness, understanding, and recognition of the terrible weight she had been carrying. "Did you ever try to find out what happened to her family?" he asked gently. Evelyn nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Her daughter had to drop out of college, couldn't afford tuition without her mother's income. She's working 2 minimum-wage jobs now, trying to pay for her grandmother's care. I've been anonymously paying for the grandmother's nursing home for the past 3 years. Does that help you sleep at night?" "Nothing helps me sleep at night," Evelyn said flatly. "I haven't had a full night's sleep since it happened. I keep thinking about what I could have done differently, what I should have said, how I could have saved her job without destroying my own career." "And what have you concluded? That I was a coward? That I chose my own comfort and security over doing what was right? That I let fear of professional consequences override my basic human decency?" Daniel studied her face, seeing not the cold corporate executive he had met at Meridian, but a woman who had been slowly destroying herself with guilt and regret. It didn't excuse her behavior, but it explained it in ways that made him understand the person behind the cruelty. "So why haven't you changed?" he asked. "If you know all this, if you carry this guilt, why haven't you tried to become someone different?" Evelyn laughed bitterly. "Change into what I've built my entire life around being someone I despise. My company, my reputation, my relationships. Everything is based on being the kind of person who can make the hard decisions that prioritize profit over people. If I suddenly developed a conscience, I'd lose everything I've worked for." "Would that be such a terrible thing?" The question seemed to surprise her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if everything you've worked for has been built on becoming someone you hate, maybe losing it wouldn't be a loss at all. Maybe it would be freedom." Evelyn stared at him as if he had suggested she jump off a building. Freedom to do what? To become irrelevant, to watch from the sidelines while other people make the decisions that shape the world. "Freedom to build something new," Daniel said simply. "Freedom to use everything you've learned about how the system works to create something better. Freedom to become the person you wanted to be when you were 16 and sitting in this booth dreaming about changing the world." "That girl is dead, Daniel. She died in a conference room in Ohio when she realized that good intentions are no match for cold, hard economics." "Are you sure about that?" Daniel asked. "Because the woman who brought that homeless veteran to Dolores's attention, who spent weeks helping him navigate the VA system, she seemed pretty alive to me when Dolores was telling that story." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. "Even if that were true," she said slowly, "even if some part of that girl survived, what could she possibly do now? I've spent 10 years becoming someone that idealistic young woman would have despised. How do you come back from that?" "One choice at a time," Daniel said. "One decision at a time. One moment of choosing compassion over convenience at a time. And throw away everything I've built in the process." "Evelyn," Daniel said gently, "what have you actually built? Really? You have money, power, influence, but do you have anything that actually matters to you? Anyone who genuinely cares about you rather than what you can do for them, any sense of purpose beyond accumulating more wealth and power?" The questions hit home with devastating accuracy. Evelyn's face went very pale, and Daniel could see her mentally cataloging her life. The empty penthouse apartment, the relationships based on utility rather than affection, the days that blended together in an endless cycle of meetings and deals and strategic decisions that benefited everyone except the person making them. "I have my work," she said weakly. "Your work that keeps you awake at night with guilt and regret, your work that requires you to become someone you can't stand to look at in the mirror. I have success. Success at what cost? Success that requires you to treat other people like obstacles to be removed rather than human beings with inherent worth. Each gentle challenge was dismantling the carefully constructed justifications she had built around her life choices. Daniel could see her struggling to find some foundation, to stand on some aspect of her current existence that she could defend without reservation. I don't know how to be anyone else, she admitted finally, her voice small and lost. I've been playing this role for so long that I don't remember who I was underneath it all. Then maybe, Daniel suggested, it's time to find out. Dolores returned to their table, having given them the privacy they needed for their intense conversation. She took one look at Evelyn's tear-streaked face and immediately pulled tissues from her apron pocket. "Honey, what's wrong?" she asked with genuine concern. "Did this man say something to upset you?" "No," Evelyn said quickly, accepting the tissues gratefully. He's been helping me remember some things I'd forgotten." Dolores looked between them with the sharp intuition of someone who had spent decades reading people's emotions. "Good things or bad things?" "Both," Evelyn said honestly. "Mostly good things that I'd convinced myself were weaknesses." "Well," Dolores said pragmatically, "sometimes we need to remember the good stuff before we can figure out how to move forward. Can I get you two anything else? Food, more coffee? A shot of whiskey to go with all this soul-searching?" Despite everything, Evelyn laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her face in ways that made her look years younger. "More coffee would be perfect, Dolores." "Thank you." As Dolores refilled their cups, she glanced at Evelyn with motherly concern. "You know, honey, your grandmother used to sit in this exact booth sometimes, especially toward the end. She'd order coffee and pie and tell me stories about you, about how proud she was, but also how worried." "Worried about what?" Evelyn asked. "About whether success was making you happy or just making you busy. She said you sounded different on the phone as the years went by. Less like the girl she remembered, more like someone playing a part." The observation was so accurate, so precisely targeted, that Evelyn had to set down her coffee cup to keep from spilling it. "She never said anything to me about being worried." "She didn't want to burden you," Dolores explained. "But she used to say that she hoped someday you'd remember that being important and being fulfilled aren't necessarily the same thing." Daniel watched Evelyn process this revelation, seeing the impact it had on hers. The knowledge that her grandmother had seen through her carefully constructed success to the emptiness underneath was clearly devastating, but also somehow liberating. "She was right," Evelyn said quietly. "I haven't been fulfilled in years. I've been achieving things, accumulating things, controlling things, but I haven't been happy. I haven't even been content." "So what are you going to do about it?" Daniel asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Evelyn looked around the diner at the worn vinyl booths, the cracked linoleum, the simple honesty of a place that didn't pretend to be anything more than what it was. Then she looked at Dolores, who was watching her with the kind of unconditional affection that couldn't be bought or negotiated. Finally, she looked at Daniel, this man she had tried to humiliate just hours earlier, who had somehow seen past her cruelty to the wounded person underneath. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I need to find out who I am when I'm not trying to prove I'm better than everyone else." "That sounds like a good place to start," Daniel said, "but I don't know how to do that." Evelyn continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I don't know how to be vulnerable, how to admit weakness, how to connect with people without trying to control or impress them. I don't know how to value things that can't be measured in dollars and cents." "Maybe you could learn," Daniel suggested. Maybe you could start by doing the things that scared the idealistic 25-year-old you. Maybe you could try helping instead of conquering. Like what? Daniel was quiet for a moment, thinking. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, thoughtful. Well, you said that woman's daughter had to drop out of college. What if there was a way to help her finish her education? What if there was a way to create opportunities for people instead of just eliminating them? Evelyn's eyes lit up with something that might have been hope. You mean like a scholarship fund, or educational grants for people whose families have been affected by corporate restructuring? Something like that. Something that uses your business knowledge and connections to create solutions instead of just optimizing existing systems. The idea seemed to energize Evelyn in a way that nothing had all evening. For the first time since they'd sat down, she looked genuinely excited about something. I could do that, she said, her voice gaining confidence. I know how to set up foundations, how to structure giving to maximize impact. I could create something that actually helps people instead of just moving money around. You could, Daniel agreed, but you'd have to be willing to do it without expecting recognition or praise. You'd have to be willing to help people who can't do anything for you in return. Like anonymous payments to nursing homes? Evelyn asked with a small smile. Like anonymous payments to nursing homes, Daniel confirmed. But bigger, broader, more systematic. They talked for another hour, their conversation ranging from practical details about charitable foundations to deeper questions about purpose and meaning. Gradually, Daniel began to see glimpses of the young woman Dolores had described, passionate, thoughtful, determined to make a difference in the world. As the night wore on and their conversation deepened, something fundamental shifted between them. The antagonistic dynamic that had defined their early interactions was replaced by something more complex, not quite friendship, but a recognition of shared humanity that transcended their obvious differences. When they finally prepared to leave the diner, Evelyn turned to Dolores with genuine emotion in her voice. Thank you, she said simply, for remembering who I used to be, for helping me remember too. Dolores hugged her with fierce affection. You come back and see me, you hear? Don't wait another 15 years to remember where you came from. I won't, Evelyn promised, and Daniel could hear in her voice that she meant it. As they stepped back out into the cool night air, the contrast between the warm, honest interior of the diner and the glittering artificial world of Manhattan's financial district seemed starker than ever. But something had changed in Evelyn during their hours of conversation. Some fundamental shift that made her seem more solid, more real, more present than she had been before. Daniel, she said, as they stood on the sidewalk outside the diner, I owe you an apology. The way I treated you tonight, the things I said, none of that was about you. It was about my own fear and anger and self-hatred. You didn't deserve to be the target of all that. Thank you, Daniel said simply. That means a lot. And I want you to know, she continued, that if I do this, if I try to become someone different, I'm going to need help. I'm going to need people who can remind me what matters when I forget. People who won't let me slide back into old patterns. Daniel studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. But what he saw was genuine uncertainty, genuine hope, and genuine fear. This wasn't a business proposal or a strategic alliance. This was a plea for human connection from someone who had almost forgotten how to ask for it. I think, he said carefully, that could be arranged. As they parted ways that night, Daniel to catch the subway back to his modest apartment in Queens, Evelyn to her penthouse overlooking Central Park, both of them carried with them the knowledge that something significant had happened. The evening that had begun with mutual contempt and misunderstanding had evolved into something neither of them had expected: the possibility of redemption, the promise of change, and the hope that it wasn't too late to become the people they had once dreamed of being. 3 weeks later, Daniel was grading essays in his apartment when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief but unmistakable. "The foundation is real. I need your help. Are you free tomorrow evening? E." He stared at the screen for a long moment. Memories of that night at the diner flooding back. Part of him had wondered if Evelyn's transformation had been genuine or just the emotional aftermath of trauma. Corporate executives were skilled at saying what people wanted to hear, and he'd half expected her passionate promises about change to evaporate once she returned to her familiar world of boardrooms and bottom lines. But here was evidence that something had stuck. The foundation was real. Daniel typed back, "Free after 6, where do you want to meet?" The response came quickly. "Not Meridian, somewhere you choose this time." He suggested a small cafe near Lincoln High, the kind of place where teachers could afford to grab coffee and students sometimes gathered after school. It was the opposite of exclusive, the opposite of impressive, and exactly the kind of test he wanted to give her. The next evening, Daniel arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early, partly out of curiosity, and partly because he wanted to observe Evelyn's reaction to the environment. The place was exactly what he'd expected: mismatched furniture, local artwork on the walls, the comfortable chaos of a community gathering spot. A few of his colleagues were scattered at various tables grading papers or planning lessons, and he recognized several students from the high school working on homework together. When Evelyn walked through the door, Daniel almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the severe Armani suit, replaced by dark jeans and a simple sweater that actually looked like something a normal person might wear. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail rather than the intimidating chignon, and she wore minimal makeup. She looked younger, more approachable, more human. But it was the way she moved through the space that really caught his attention. Instead of striding through with the commanding presence, he remembered she seemed almost tentative, as if she were genuinely uncertain about how she fit into this environment. When she spotted him at a corner table, her smile was nervous rather than calculated. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, as she sat down, her voice carrying none of the authoritative tone he remembered from their first encounter. "Thank you for following through," Daniel replied. "I have to admit I wasn't entirely sure you would." Evelyn's cheeks flushed slightly. "I almost didn't. 3 different times I started to convince myself that the whole thing was impractical, that I was being naive, that I should focus on what I know how to do well." "What changed your mind?" "Emma, actually." Daniel's eyebrows rose in surprise. "My Emma, my daughter?" "Well, not directly, but I kept thinking about what you said that night, about raising a daughter who judges people by their actions rather than their net worth. And I realized that if I ever want to be the kind of person who deserves that kind of respect, I need to start acting like it." She pulled a manila folder from her bag and set it on the table between them. "The Second Chance Educational Foundation. I've set aside $5 million in initial funding, with plans to add more as we identify effective programs. The mission is to provide educational opportunities to people whose families have been affected by corporate restructuring." Daniel opened the folder and found himself looking at professionally prepared documents that represented weeks of serious work. There were legal papers establishing the foundation, detailed financial projections, and a comprehensive plan for identifying and supporting recipients. "This is impressive," he said, genuinely surprised by the thoroughness of her preparation. "And you want me to help with what exactly?" "With everything," Evelyn said simply. "I know how to set up the structure, how to manage the money, how to ensure legal compliance. But I don't know how to identify the people who need help. I don't know how to approach them without making them feel like objects of charity. I don't know how to create programs that actually make a difference, rather than just making me feel better about myself. Her honesty was disarming. This wasn't the confident corporate executive trying to manage another acquisition. This was someone genuinely admitting the limits of her expertise and asking for help. "Why me?" Daniel asked. "There are professional philanthropists, people whose entire careers are built around this kind of work." "Because you're the one who saw through my bullshit," Evelyn said bluntly. "Because you didn't let me get away with using generosity as another form of control. Because you understand what it means to make choices based on principle rather than profit." She paused, seeming to gather her courage before continuing. "And because I need someone who will call me out if I start slipping back into old patterns. Someone who cares more about the mission than about keeping me happy." Daniel studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. But what he saw was something he hadn't expected: genuine vulnerability. The woman sitting across from him wasn't trying to impress him or control him. She was asking for help in the way that people ask when they're genuinely lost and need direction. "Okay," he said slowly, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, this has to be about the people we're helping, not about rehabilitating your image or assuaging your guilt. The moment this becomes about making you feel better about yourself instead of making their lives better, I'm out." Evelyn nodded solemnly. "Agreed." "Second, no publicity. No press releases about your generous philanthropy, no galas where you get recognition for your charitable work. If this is real, it has to be done quietly, without fanfare." "That's actually perfect," Evelyn said. "Public philanthropy would just be another form of corporate marketing. I want this to be different." "Third, I need to know that you're prepared for how hard this is going to be. Not just the logistics, but the emotional weight. We're going to meet people whose lives have been destroyed by decisions exactly like the ones you used to make. People who have every reason to hate everything you represent. Are you prepared for that?" For the first time since sitting down, Evelyn looked genuinely frightened. But she didn't back down. "I think I need to be prepared for that. I think I need to understand the full impact of the choices I've made if I'm ever going to make different ones." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing her response. Everything about this conversation felt different from their first meeting, more honest, more equal, more focused on substance than power dynamics. "All right," he said finally. "Let's start with Sarah Mitchell." "Who's Sarah Mitchell?" "The daughter of the woman who killed herself after your company closed her store. The one who had to drop out of college." Evelyn went very pale. "You know about her. You mentioned her at the diner. I did some research afterward." Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. "If this foundation is real, if this change is real, then she should be our first recipient. Not because it will make you feel better about what happened, but because she deserves the opportunity her mother's death took away from her." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes, but she didn't look away. "How do we find her?" "I already have," Daniel said quietly. "She's working 2 jobs in Toledo, trying to save money to finish her degree. She doesn't know that anyone connected to Cross Industries knows her story." "What do we tell her?" "The truth. That there's a foundation designed to help people whose families have been affected by corporate restructuring. That she qualifies for a full scholarship to complete her education. That there are no strings attached and no publicity involved." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the weight of the decision. "And if she rejects the help, if she doesn't want anything from the company that destroyed her family, Then we respect her choice, Daniel said simply. But we give her the option to choose. Over the next hour, they worked out the details of how to approach Sarah Mitchell and several other potential recipients Daniel had identified. As they talked, Daniel found himself genuinely impressed by Evelyn's transformation. She asked thoughtful questions, listened carefully to his suggestions, and never once tried to assert authority or control over the process. But it was when one of his students approached their table that Daniel really saw how much she had changed. "Mr. Hayes," the voice belonged to Marcus Williams, a junior in Daniel's history class, who was working his way through a challenging home situation with a single mother and two younger siblings. "Hey, Marcus. How's the essay coming along?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Evelyn with obvious uncertainty. "It's fine, I guess. I wanted to ask if you thought there were any scholarships or something that might help with community college. My mom's been working extra shifts, but the money's still pretty tight." Before Daniel could respond, Evelyn spoke up with surprising gentleness. "Marcus, I'm Evelyn. I couldn't help overhearing, and I actually might be able to help with that scholarship question." Daniel watched carefully as Evelyn talked with Marcus about educational opportunities, noting how she spoke to him as an equal rather than talking down to him. She asked about his interests, his goals, his concerns about financing his education. There was none of the condescension he might have expected, none of the calculated charm of someone trying to impress an audience. When Marcus left their table with Evelyn's business card and a promise to follow up about scholarship opportunities, Daniel found himself genuinely moved by what he'd witnessed. "That was well done," he said quietly. "I was terrified I'd say the wrong thing," Evelyn admitted. "I'm not used to talking to teenagers. I'm not used to talking to anyone really without an agenda or a script." "You did fine. Better than fine, actually. You treated him like a person with his own agency rather than a problem to be solved." The compliment seemed to affect Evelyn deeply. "Is that what I used to do, treat people like problems to be solved, rather than human beings with their own dignity?" "Often, yes." She absorbed this with the kind of serious consideration that suggested she was genuinely trying to understand her past behavior, rather than just seeking absolution for it. "How do I learn to do better?" she asked. "By listening more than you talk. By asking what people need rather than assuming you know. By remembering that everyone you meet is the main character in their own story, not just a supporting player in yours." They talked for another hour about the practical and philosophical aspects of the foundation work. As the evening progressed, Daniel found himself adjusting his assessment of Evelyn's transformation. This wasn't the temporary emotional response to trauma he'd initially suspected. This seemed to be a genuine attempt to reconstruct her entire approach to human relationships. But it was when they were preparing to leave that Evelyn revealed the full extent of how much her life had changed. "Daniel," she said hesitantly, "I need to tell you something else. Something I haven't told anyone." "What's that?" "I've resigned from Cross Industries." Daniel stared at her in shock. "You what?" "I gave my notice 2 weeks ago. My last day is Friday." "Evelyn, that's your entire life. Your entire identity. Are you sure about this?" She smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it was a smile completely free of calculation or agenda. "I've never been more sure of anything. I can't keep being the person who makes the decisions that destroy families like Sarah Mitchell's. I can't keep pretending that maximizing shareholder value is worth the human cost." "What are you going to do?" "Focus on the foundation full time. Use everything I learned about business to create something that actually helps people instead of just enriching investors." She paused, looking almost shy. and I was hoping you might consider leaving teaching to work with me." The offer caught Daniel completely off guard. "What? I know it's presumptuous of me to ask. I know you love teaching, and I know you have Emma to think about. But I need someone who understands both the education system and the communities we're trying to serve. Someone who can help me stay grounded in what actually matters." Daniel felt a complex mix of emotions as he processed her offer. The practical side of him immediately began calculating the financial implications. Foundation work would undoubtedly pay better than teaching, which would mean more opportunities for Emma, more security for their future. But the deeper question was whether he trusted Evelyn enough to tie his career to her transformation. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course, take all the time you need." And Daniel, "Even if you decide not to work with the foundation directly, I hope you'll still be willing to help guide me through this. I don't think I can do it alone." As they parted ways that evening, Daniel found himself thinking about the extraordinary journey Evelyn had taken in just 3 weeks. From the cruel, calculating woman who had mocked his subway ride to someone willing to give up everything she'd worked for, in order to help the kind of people she used to dismiss, it was a transformation that should have been impossible. But watching her interact with Marcus, seeing the genuine humility in her questions about how to do better, observing the way she'd structured the foundation to focus on impact rather than recognition, all of it suggested that her change was real, deep, and lasting. Over the following week, Daniel found himself thinking constantly about Evelyn's offer. He loved teaching, but he also recognized that the foundation work could potentially help far more people than he could reach in a single classroom. The question was whether he could trust someone who had shown herself capable of such calculated cruelty to maintain her commitment to compassion when the initial emotional impulse faded. His answer came when he received a call from Sarah Mitchell. "Mr. Hayes?" The voice was young, tentative, but hopeful. "You don't know me, but someone from the Second Chance Educational Foundation gave me your number. She said you were the one who suggested I might qualify for their scholarship program." Daniel's heart began beating faster. "Yes, Sarah. How can I help you?" I wanted to thank you, and to ask if this is real, if this foundation really exists, if there's really a chance I could finish my degree." "It's real," Daniel assured her, "and you absolutely qualify." "The woman I spoke with, Evelyn Cross, she knew about my mother. She knew about what happened with the store closure. But instead of making excuses or trying to minimize it, she apologized. She said that the foundation was specifically designed to help people whose families had been hurt by corporate decisions, and that my situation was exactly what they were trying to address." Daniel felt a warmth spreading through his chest as he listened to Sarah's account. This was exactly the approach he had hoped Evelyn would take, honest, direct, focused on Sarah's needs rather than her own guilt. "She also said something that really surprised me," Sarah continued. "She said that if I decided to accept the scholarship, I should understand that it wasn't charity. She said it was an investment in my potential, and that the foundation's success would be measured by what I accomplished, with the opportunity, not by how grateful I was for receiving it." The sophisticated understanding of dignity that Evelyn's words demonstrated convinced Daniel that her transformation was genuine. She wasn't trying to create dependence or buy forgiveness. She was trying to restore opportunities that had been taken away. "Are you going to accept the scholarship?" Daniel asked. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm going to finish my degree, and then I'm going to find ways to help other people who've been in similar situations." Ms. Cross said that was exactly the kind of impact the foundation was hoping for. After ending the call with Sarah, Daniel immediately texted Evelyn. "I'm in. When do we start?" Her response came within minutes. "Thank you. You won't regret this." But as Daniel prepared to leave teaching for this new venture, he realized that the question wasn't whether he would regret the decision. The question was whether Evelyn could sustain her transformation when she faced the inevitable challenges and setbacks that came with trying to help people rather than simply managing them. That test came sooner than either of them expected. 2 months into their work with the foundation, they encountered their first major crisis. They had been working with a family in Michigan whose breadwinner had lost his job when the auto parts factory, where he'd worked for 18 years, was closed and relocated to Mexico. The foundation had provided scholarship support for his daughter's college education and job retraining funds for him to learn new skills. But when the local newspaper got wind of the story, they didn't focus on the family's resilience or the daughter's academic achievements. Instead, they wrote a scathing editorial about corporate executives trying to buy their way out of guilt, using the foundation as a prime example of how the wealthy used charity as a public relations tool. The editorial was brutal in its assessment of Evelyn, specifically calling her a robber baron in sheep's clothing, and suggesting that her philanthropy was just another form of exploitation. It detailed her role in several high-profile corporate restructurings and questioned whether someone with her track record could ever genuinely care about the people she'd spent her career discarding. Daniel found Evelyn in the foundation's modest offices the morning the editorial was published, staring at her computer screen with an expression of profound hurt and disappointment. "They're not wrong, are they?" she said without looking up. "About my track record, about the people I've hurt." "They're wrong about your motivations now," Daniel said firmly. "They're wrong about what this foundation represents and what you're trying to accomplish." "But what if they're not? What if this is just another form of manipulation, just another way of controlling the narrative around my past behavior?" Daniel could see her spiraling into the kind of self-doubt that could destroy everything she'd built. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, the test of whether her transformation could survive external pressure and internal uncertainty. "Evelyn," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Look at me." She turned away from the computer screen, her blue eyes filled with tears. "Do you remember what you told Sarah Mitchell when you first spoke with her?" Daniel asked. I told her that the scholarship wasn't charity, that it was an investment in her potential. And do you remember why you told her that? Because I wanted her to understand that she had value beyond her circumstances, that she deserved the opportunity to succeed. And was that manipulation? Was that about managing your image or controlling how people perceived you? Evelyn considered the question seriously, as she had learned to do with all of Daniel's challenges to her thinking. "No," she said slowly. "It was about trying to give her what she needed to rebuild her life." "Then that's your answer. The people writing editorials don't know what happens in this office every day. They don't see the conversations you have with scholarship recipients, the way you listen to their concerns, the way you adjust programs based on their feedback. They don't see the person you've become." "But what if the publicity hurts the people we're trying to help? What if families decide they don't want to be associated with a foundation that's controversial?" It was a legitimate concern, and Daniel appreciated that her first thought was about protecting the families rather than defending herself. "Then we address it directly," he said. "We talk to each family individually, explain the situation, and let them decide whether they want to continue with the foundation. We give them agency in the decision." Over the next week, they did exactly that. They reached out to every family the foundation was supporting, explained the media controversy, and offered to help them find alternative support if they preferred not to be associated with the foundation. The responses were more varied than either of them had expected. Some families, particularly those who had been directly affected by Evelyn's past decisions at Cross Industries, chose to end their relationship with the foundation. Daniel watched Evelyn accept these decisions with grace and without argument, even helping to connect these families with other organizations that could provide similar support. But other families, like Sarah Mitchell's, chose to continue with the foundation. Sarah herself wrote the letter to the newspaper defending Evelyn's work, pointing out that whatever mistakes she had made in the past, her current efforts were having real positive impacts on real people's lives. The controversy gradually faded, but it left both Daniel and Evelyn with a deeper understanding of the complexity of redemption. For Evelyn, it reinforced that her past would always be part of her story, but that it didn't have to define her future actions. For Daniel, it confirmed that her transformation was robust enough to survive external pressure and internal doubt. But perhaps the most important outcome of the crisis was the way it deepened their working relationship. They had navigated a serious challenge together, each supporting the other through moments of uncertainty and doubt. The dynamic between them had evolved from teacher and student to genuine partners in a shared mission. As autumn turned to winter, the foundation expanded its reach and refined its approach. They developed programs not just for individual scholarships, but for community-wide initiatives that addressed the broader economic impacts of corporate restructuring. They created partnerships with local colleges and vocational schools to ensure that their scholarship recipients had comprehensive support systems. Through it all, Daniel watched Evelyn continue to grow into her new role. She learned to listen without trying to control conversations, to ask questions without predetermined agendas, to accept criticism without becoming defensive. She developed genuine relationships with scholarship recipients and their families' relationships based on mutual respect rather than charity. But it was a conversation with Emma that finally convinced Daniel that Evelyn's transformation was complete and permanent. Emma had been curious about the foundation work and had asked to meet the woman Daniel had been working with. Daniel arranged for a casual lunch where Emma could satisfy her curiosity, and he could observe how Evelyn interacted with his daughter. "So you used to be mean to my dad?" Emma asked with the directness that only 12-year-olds could manage. Evelyn didn't hesitate or try to soften the truth. "Yes, I was. I said cruel things to him because I was angry at myself, and I took it out on him. It was wrong, and I'm sorry for it. But you're not mean anymore. I'm trying not to be. Your dad is helping me learn how to be kinder, how to think about other people's feelings before I speak." Emma studied Evelyn with the serious consideration she gave to all important matters. "Dad says that people can change if they really want to. Do you really want to?" "More than anything," Evelyn said simply. "Good," Emma declared, apparently satisfied with this assessment. "Because Dad's really happy with his new job, and I like seeing him happy." Later, as they walked home from lunch, Emma slipped her hand into Daniel's with the casual affection that still amazed him every day. "I like her," she announced. "She's not like other rich people." "What do you mean?" "She talks to me like I'm a real person, not like I'm cute or need to be impressed. And she listens when I talk, instead of just waiting for her turn to speak." The observation was so perceptive, so accurate in its assessment of what made Evelyn different now that Daniel felt a surge of pride in his daughter's emotional intelligence. That evening, after Emma was in bed, Daniel reflected on the extraordinary journey he and Evelyn had taken together. From their disastrous first dinner to their current partnership, it had been a story of transformation that he still sometimes found hard to believe. But the evidence was everywhere in the scholarship recipients who were rebuilding their lives in the communities that were benefiting from the Foundation's programs in Evelyn's own evolution, from corporate predator to genuine humanitarian. The woman who had once mocked his subway ride now took public transportation herself, claiming it helped her stay connected to the real experiences of the people they served. The woman who had dismissed his career as irrelevant now regularly asked his advice about everything from program development to interpersonal relationships. Most importantly, the woman who had once used her wealth and power to humiliate others now used those same resources to create opportunities and restore dignity. As Daniel prepared for bed that night, he realized that their story had become something neither of them had expected when they first sat down to that fateful dinner at Meridian. It had become a testament to the possibility of genuine change proof that people could choose to become better versions of themselves if they were willing to do the difficult work of honest self-examination. But more than that, it had become a friendship built on mutual respect, shared values, and a common commitment to making the world a little bit better than they had found it. And in a city that often celebrated individual achievement over collective good, that kind of partnership felt like its own form of quiet revolution. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late spring, almost 2 years after that transformative night at Meridian. Daniel was reviewing scholarship applications when his phone buzzed with Evelyn's number. Her voice carried an excitement he hadn't heard since the early days of the foundation. "Daniel, you need to get down here right away," she said, barely containing her enthusiasm. "Something incredible has happened." 20 minutes later, Daniel found Evelyn in the foundation's conference room, surrounded by papers and looking more animated than he'd seen her in months. Across from her sat a young woman who looked vaguely familiar, though he couldn't immediately place her. "Daniel," Evelyn said, rising from her chair. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Sarah Mitchell." The name hit him like a physical blow. This was the young woman whose mother had died by suicide after losing her job, the first scholarship recipient, the person whose story had launched their entire mission. But the woman sitting before him bore little resemblance to the broken, desperate person he had imagined. Sarah Mitchell was poised, confident, radiating the kind of quiet strength that came from overcoming enormous challenges. "Dr. Mitchell," Daniel said, extending his hand. "It's an honor to finally meet you in person." "The honor is mine," Sarah replied, her handshake firm and steady. "You're the one who convinced Ms. Cross to reach out to me in the first place. You literally changed the course of my life." "We just opened a door," Daniel said modestly. "You're the one who walked through it." Sarah laughed, a sound filled with genuine warmth. "I did more than walk through it. I ran through it, graduated summa cum laude, got accepted to medical school, and just finished my residency in emergency medicine. But that's not why I'm here." She turned to include Evelyn in the conversation, her expression growing more serious. "I'm here because I want to give back. I want to establish a partnership between the foundation and the hospital where I'll be working. We're located in a community that's been hit hard by factory closures and economic restructuring, the kind of place where your foundation could make a real difference." Over the next hour, Sarah outlined her vision for a comprehensive support program that would combine medical care, educational opportunities, and economic development in communities affected by corporate restructuring. It was ambitious, thoughtful, and exactly the kind of systemic approach that Daniel and Evelyn had been working toward. But it was Sarah's personal motivation that truly moved them both. "I could have chosen to work anywhere," she explained. "Big city hospitals were offering me positions with impressive salaries and prestigious opportunities. But I kept thinking about my mother, about all the people in small towns who feel forgotten when the economic foundation of their community disappears. I want to be the kind of doctor who stays, who helps communities heal from more than just physical ailments." As Sarah spoke, Daniel found himself watching Evelyn's face. He could see the impact of Sarah's words, the way they validated everything the foundation had been trying to accomplish. This wasn't just about individual success stories. This was about creating a ripple effect of compassion and commitment that could transform entire communities. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her voice growing softer. "I've been carrying this with me for 2 years, and I need to say it." She turned to face Evelyn directly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "When I first learned that you were the CEO who had approved the closure of my mother's store, I hated you. I hated everything you represented, everything you had taken from my family. When the foundation first contacted me, I almost refused the scholarship because I didn't want anything from the woman who had destroyed my life." Evelyn had gone very still, her face pale but attentive. Daniel could see her bracing herself for condemnation, for the kind of confrontation she had been dreading since the foundation began. "But then I met you," Sarah continued, "and I realized that you weren't the callous corporate executive I had imagined. You were someone who had made terrible mistakes, but was genuinely trying to make amends. You were someone who understood that true redemption requires action, not just apology." She paused, gathering her courage before delivering the words that would reshape everything. "I forgive you," she said simply. "Not because what you did was okay, but because I've seen who you've chosen to become. I've seen the lives you've changed, the opportunities you've created, the way you've used your power to heal instead of harm. My mother would have been proud of what her tragedy helped inspire." The silence that followed was profound, charged with the weight of genuine forgiveness and redemption. Daniel watched as Evelyn struggled to process Sarah's words, tears streaming down her face as years of guilt and shame finally began to lift. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness, but I promise you, I'll never stop trying to earn it." "You already have," Sarah said firmly. "Now let's figure out how to help other families avoid going through what mine did." The partnership that emerged from that meeting became the Foundation's most ambitious and successful program. Sarah's hospital became the anchor for a comprehensive community development initiative that addressed healthcare, education, economic opportunity, and social support in struggling post-industrial towns across the Midwest. But beyond its practical impact, the partnership represented something deeper: proof that genuine redemption was possible, that people could transform not just themselves, but the very communities that had been harmed by their past actions. As summer arrived, Daniel found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. The foundation now supported hundreds of families, had established partnerships with dozens of organizations, and was beginning to influence policy discussions about corporate responsibility and community development. But the most meaningful changes were personal. Evelyn had become someone he genuinely respected and cared about, a true partner in work that felt more important than anything he had ever done. Emma had gained what she called a bonus aunt, who remembered her birthday, attended her school plays, and provided the kind of stable adult relationship that enriched her young life. And Daniel himself had discovered that leaving teaching hadn't meant abandoning education. It had simply expanded his classroom to include entire communities and his curriculum to encompass real-world problem-solving that could transform lives. The test of how completely their relationship had evolved came in an unexpected way. Daniel was working late one evening when Evelyn knocked on his office door, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. "There's something I need to discuss with you." Daniel gestured to the chair across from his desk, noting the formal tone in her voice. "What's on your mind?" Evelyn sat down, then immediately stood up again, clearly struggling with whatever she wanted to say. "This is going to sound strange, but I need to ask you something. And I need you to be completely honest with me. Okay, Daniel said slowly, genuinely curious about what could make her so obviously uncomfortable. Do you think, she began, then stopped gathering her courage. Do you think there's any possibility that what happened between us that first night, the way you saw through my defenses and challenged me to become better, do you think any of that had to do with more than just professional or moral obligation? Daniel felt his heart skip a beat as he processed what she was really asking. What do you mean? I mean, Evelyn said, her words coming out in a rush. Do you think there's any chance that the connection we've developed, the way we work together, the way we seem to understand each other, do you think any of that could be the foundation for something more than just professional partnership? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with months of unspoken possibility and carefully maintained boundaries. Daniel found himself thinking back to their first disastrous dinner, to the night at the diner, when he had first glimpsed the woman beneath the corporate armor, to all the moments since when he had felt drawn to her intelligence, her growing compassion, her genuine commitment to becoming a better person. Evelyn, he said carefully, are you asking if I have feelings for you? Her cheeks flushed, but she met his eyes steadily. I'm asking if there's any possibility that this partnership could become something more. Because she took a deep breath. I think I'm falling in love with you, and I need to know if that's completely one-sided, or if there's any chance you might feel the same way. The honesty of her confession was breathtaking. This was the same woman who had once hidden behind cruelty and manipulation, now making herself completely vulnerable in a way that required enormous courage. Daniel stood up and moved around his desk, taking her hands in his. It's not one-sided, he said gently. I've been trying not to acknowledge my feelings because I wasn't sure if they were appropriate given how our relationship started and how much you've changed. And now I think maybe those feelings aren't a complication of our work together, Daniel said, his voice growing more confident. Maybe they're part of what makes our work together so effective. Maybe caring about each other as people makes us better at caring about the people we serve. The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, filled with the recognition that they were crossing a threshold that would change everything between them. But it was also natural, inevitable, the culmination of months of growing trust and deepening affection. When they finally broke apart, Evelyn was smiling through her tears. I never thought I'd be capable of this, she said softly. Of caring about someone more than I care about protecting myself. Of trusting someone enough to be vulnerable with them. You're capable of more than you know, Daniel said, echoing words he had spoken to her that first night at the diner. You always were. You just needed to give yourself permission to find out. The relationship that developed between them was unlike anything either had experienced before. It was built on mutual respect, shared values, and a deep understanding of each other's flaws and strengths. They argued about foundation strategy, challenged each other's assumptions, and pushed each other to think more deeply about their work and their lives. But there was also tenderness, laughter, and the kind of intimate conversation that came from two people who had seen each other at their worst and chosen to love each other anyway. Emma's reaction to their relationship was characteristically direct. I already knew you liked each other, she announced over dinner one evening. You get this stupid look on your faces when you're talking to each other. Stupid look? Daniel protested, while Evelyn laughed. Yeah, like you're surprised that someone that awesome actually wants to hang out with you, Emma said with 12-year-old wisdom. It's cute, but also kind of obvious. The Foundation's second anniversary celebration was held at the same community center where they had first launched their scholarship program. The room was filled with scholarship recipients, community partners, staff members, and the families whose lives had been touched by their work. Sarah Mitchell was there, now established in her new position and already making waves with her innovative community health programs. Marcus Williams, the student who had approached their table that first night at the cafe, was preparing to start his sophomore year of college on a full foundation scholarship. Dozens of other young people were pursuing education and career opportunities that had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. But it was the presence of Dolores from the diner that brought the evening full circle. Now in her 70s, but still sharp as ever, she had become an informal advisor to the foundation, helping them understand the real needs of working families and communities. "Look at this," Dolores said to Daniel and Evelyn as they stood together watching the celebration. "Look at all these young people, all these families who have hope again, because you two figured out how to use your talents for something that actually matters." "We had help," Evelyn said modestly. "A lot of help." "Sure you did. But you also had to choose to change Honey, and that choice wasn't easy or simple or guaranteed to work out. You took a risk on becoming a better person, and look what happened." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Daniel and Evelyn found themselves alone in the community center, surrounded by the remnants of the celebration and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. "Do you ever think about that night at Meridian?" Evelyn asked as they packed up the remaining materials. "About how differently things could have turned out?" "Sometimes," Daniel admitted. "If the gunman hadn't appeared, if we'd just finished our dinner and gone our separate ways, if you hadn't been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about yourself. I think I would have gone home that night and convinced myself that you were the problem," Evelyn said thoughtfully. "That your criticism was just jealousy or naivety. I would have dismissed everything you said and gone back to being exactly the same person I was before." "What changed that?" "The crisis," Evelyn said simply. "Being genuinely afraid, genuinely dependent on someone else's protection, genuinely forced to confront my own vulnerability. It stripped away all the defenses I usually use to avoid uncomfortable truths." Daniel considered this, thinking about the strange alchemy of events that had transformed their mutual contempt into genuine partnership and eventually into love. "Maybe that's what real change requires," he said. "Not just intellectual recognition that something needs to be different, but an emotional crisis that makes continuing the old pattern impossible." "Is that what happened to you too?" Evelyn asked. "When you decided to leave teaching, in a way," Daniel said. "I had to reach a point where staying in my comfort zone felt like a betrayal of everything I claimed to believe about making a difference in the world." They locked up the community center and walked out into the warm summer night, their hands intertwined, their steps unhurried. The city around them hummed with its usual energy, the endless cycle of ambition and struggle, success and failure, connection and isolation that defined urban life. But they moved through it now with a sense of purpose and belonging that neither had possessed 2 years earlier. They had found their place in the world not by achieving individual success, but by learning to use their talents in service of something larger than themselves. "Evelyn," Daniel said as they reached her car, "do you ever regret giving up your old life? The power, the prestige, the financial security?" She turned to face him, her blue eyes bright in the streetlight. "I regret that it took me so long to realize that none of those things were making me happy. I regret all the people I hurt before I learned to use my abilities differently. But regret giving up that life?" She shook her head firmly. "Never. This life, this work, this relationship, it's everything I never knew I wanted. Even when it's difficult, even when we face criticism or setbacks or uncertainty about funding. Especially then," Evelyn said with conviction. "Because now when I face challenges, I'm facing them as myself, not as some artificial version of myself designed to impress other people. I'm facing them with people I love, working on things that matter, using my real strengths instead of hiding behind defenses. As they drove through the quiet streets toward home, the modest house in Queens that Daniel and Emma shared, and that Evelyn had been spending more and more time in, Daniel reflected on the profound truth of her words. The transformation that had begun with cruelty and contempt continued through crisis and confrontation, and evolved into partnership and love, had ultimately been about the courage to become authentic. The foundation would continue to grow and evolve, touching more lives and creating more opportunities. Emma would continue to develop into the kind of young woman who judged people by their character rather than their circumstances. Communities across the country would continue to benefit from programs that addressed both immediate needs and systemic challenges. But beneath all of these external achievements was a simpler, more fundamental victory: two people who had learned to see past their initial judgments of each other, who had chosen growth over comfort, who had discovered that the most profound changes often began with the willingness to admit that change was necessary. Years later, when they told the story of how they met at foundation events, at family gatherings, to Emma's friends, who wondered how a teacher and a former CEO had ended up together, they would always emphasize the same point, that the most important transformations rarely happened in isolation, that people needed other people to challenge them, support them, and hold them accountable for becoming their best selves. The night that had begun with mutual disdain at an expensive restaurant had evolved into a partnership that changed not just their own lives, but the lives of hundreds of families who had found hope and opportunity through their work. It was a reminder that even the most unlikely encounters could become the foundation for profound change if people were willing to see past their initial impressions and remain open to the possibility of growth. As they pulled into the driveway of their shared home, Emma's light still on as she finished her homework, Daniel and Evelyn knew that their story was far from over. There would be more challenges to face, more communities to serve, more opportunities to choose compassion for convenience and connection over control. But they would face those challenges together, grounded in the knowledge that genuine transformation was possible, that people could choose to become better versions of themselves, and that the most meaningful successes were those that lifted others up rather than simply elevating oneself. The woman who had once mocked a man's subway ride now took public transportation herself, not out of necessity, but out of choice, as a reminder to stay connected to the real experiences of the people they served. The man who had once felt powerless to change systemic injustices now helped design programs that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Together, they had learned that true strength came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the courage to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to change course when necessary, and to use whatever power they possessed in service of justice and compassion. In a world that often celebrated individual achievement over collective good, their partnership stood as proof that the most profound victories were those that created space for others to succeed, that true success was measured not in personal accumulation, but in the positive impact one could have on other lives. And in the quiet moments watching Emma practice her violin, working side by side on foundation strategy, sharing stories over dinner with families whose lives had been transformed by their programs, they found the kind of contentment that could never be purchased or negotiated, only earned through the patient work of becoming the people they had always had the potential to be. Their love story was also a redemption story, a testament to the possibility of second chances and the power of human connection to inspire the best in people. It proved that sometimes the most beautiful relationships grew not from instant attraction or perfect compatibility, but from the willingness to see past surface judgments to the complex, flawed, struggling, hopeful human beings underneath. The diner, where they had first begun to understand each other, remained a regular stop in their lives, a place where they could remember where they had come from and recommit to the values that guided their work. Dolores, now in her 80s, still remembered how they liked their coffee and still offered the kind of wisdom that could only come from decades of watching people struggle and grow and change. "You know," she said to them one evening as they sat in their old booth, "I've seen a lot of people come and go through those doors. I've seen folks at their best and their worst, seen them fall apart and put themselves back together. But what you two did, learning to see past your first impressions, choosing to become better people, using your talents to help others, that's something special. That's the kind of change that gives an old woman hope for the world." As they walked out of the diner that night, past the flickering neon sign, and into the warm embrace of the city they now called home, in a completely different way than either had before, Daniel and Evelyn carried with them the quiet satisfaction of lives well lived, work well done, and love well earned. Their story had become proof that transformation was possible at any age, that people could choose to become better versions of themselves, and that the most meaningful changes often began with the simple recognition that change was necessary. In a world that sometimes seemed divided between those who had power and those who suffered from its abuse, they had found a different path, one that used power as a tool for healing rather than harm, for building rather than destroying, for creating opportunities rather than eliminating them. And in the end, that transformation from cruelty to compassion, from isolation to connection, from selfishness to service, became their greatest achievement, not just as individuals, but as partners in the ongoing work of making the world a little bit better than they had found it.